The student bar didn't have what I was looking for. Not at first, anyway. The drinks were fine and all, I just wasn't there to get drunk. I looked over my glass, the dimly lit room, seeing dozens of girls just like me and twice as many guys begging for their attention. I took another swig. It was a pathetic turnout. I guess you could say that I was something of a slut. An ugly word. Mum would be so proud. University hadn't been the social blossoming I was sold back in high school, and it wasn't long before I got burnt out. Tied to a degree I knew would lead to nothing, and looking forward to student debt for the next 3 decades. So I said to myself, you know what? Fuck it. A younger girl sat beside me and ordered some fruity cocktail. First year, I thought. But let me tell you, she was all leg. From the corner of my eye, I looked down at her well-toned thighs and calves. God damn! She must have run track before she came to this dead end of teenage perpetuation. Skin. I made a hobby of it, and soon it became like a game to me. A hunt, if you will. I stopped caring about grades, and every other night I potted down to this bar, on the prowl for whatever passed for a fine piece of arse in this place. And let me tell you, I had my fair share. Girls were like fruit, and I loved to go picking. The guys, well, they never really got that I didn't swing that way. The new girl that sat next to me with her fruity cocktail was nothing short of ripe. Her big, innocent eyes were like that of a lamb. I licked my lips. Sure, she had the dyed hair that screamed, "I'm studying arts and I think I'm unique." It was green. But she wasn't just another colour out of a box. "It's kind of quiet," she said nervously. I held up my glass and made the universal actually face. Atmospheric. The word you're looking for is atmospheric. Green giggled something. Maybe told me her name, maybe not. I didn't really care what she had to say. I found my victim, and now I was on the hunt. I just started. Back in the day, studies. Where are you from? I caught bits and pieces of what she said, remembering to nod and to make interested faces at all the right points. I liked the way her lips moved. I licked mine as I thought of what I could make them do. It's the damnedest thing. I don't actually remember what I said to hook her in. Green, like all the other girls like her, was so easy. Before I knew it, we were outside. I shivered. I always hated the cold. But Green held my hand and pranced along beside me like a little deer. "Oh, it was such a good idea to watch the moon together," she said. "You're so smart. There's a billabong nearby that'll be perfect." I grinned, watching her bounce excitedly. She reminded me of those innocent frigates back in high school. There's always one. A prude in recovery. Will she need help taking my bra off? I thought. What do you think? She asked, standing before the billabong like it was the most impressive thing she had ever seen. It's okay. And it really was just okay. A still little body of water, surrounded by trees and full of algae and clumps of weeds. Green stood at the shore, looking up at a moon that I must have feigned interest in. I came up behind, wrapped my arms around her perfectly flat belly, and kissed her neck. Fuck, she smelled so good. She was defenseless, so vulnerable, at the mercies of my sexual hunger. I felt powerful. My skin burned with excited blood. I slid my hands across her body and pulled at her blouse. All the while, she just smiled and looked at the moon. There was a mood-killing squelch as I trod in some mud. I grimaced as I felt cold bog water flood my shoe and wet my sock. Truly, there is nothing on earth worse than wet socks. I tried to pull my foot up without looking away from Green, but there was a harsh tug of something snagged. I pulled again, slightly angled, might have held escape. No dice. Oh, for fuck's sake, I spat. I looked to my foot, to whatever the hell I had snagged it on. And my mouth went dry with a scared confusion. A hand. Coming out from the water of the billabong was a hand attached to a slender bare arm. What the fuck? I stared, not really with that Hollywood screaming terror, but confused more than anything. Something out of the blue, as it were. I tried to comprehend it. Then, suddenly, the arm tensed, its elbow bent, and using my leg as an anchor, pulled the naked upper body of a woman out from the billabong. She hissed at me. Her green hair flowed behind her into the weeds and algae. No, it was the weeds and algae. I fell back into the mud and tried to kick her off, but with each consecutive pull, she came further and further out of the water, revealing more of her wet body, a body that seemed to grow dark and change form at around her belly button. I screamed at Green, "Help! Get this fucking thing off me!" She looked down at me, so pathetic, vulnerable. She flashed a fanged smile, and there was a hunger in her eyes. I knew then that she was on the hunt. Her hair moved on its own now. I saw it writhe, algae green, like the monster's hair in the billabong, and it slithered about like hundreds of tiny snakes. Somebody fucking help me! I screamed again, but Green simply raised an arm and waved her hand without taking her eyes off me. The dark clouds swirled to life, and the moon over Green's shoulder was quickly hidden by thick storm clouds. Lightning cracked, rain poured, and no one could hear my screams. Green got down and straddled me as I hopelessly cried. She licked her lips. Her hands fiddled with the button on my shorts, and she brought her face closer to mine. I tried to push her off, but all the strength in my arms was nothing to her. She hardly moved. I turned my face away, cheek pressed hard into the mud, trying to keep away from whatever the hell Green was. The monster woman, pulling herself from the billabong, sank her teeth into my leg just above the knee. The tendrils of Green's hair jerked and wrapped around my head. I was too weak to stop them, and they forced my face to Green's as she pursed her lips. There are many words to describe mermaids, but the word I'd like to use is limited. Fish women that sing you to your doom with only the power of your lust at their disposal. How do you beat a mermaid? It's simple. Move away from the coast. But the Yorker, or just Yorker for the sake of simplicity, is anything but simple. The traditional Danish story of the Little Mermaid depicts little fair-skinned Ariel wanting nothing more than to be able to walk on land. But the Yorker never found themselves trapped by the sea. These powerful creatures inhabited both fresh and salt water and, most importantly, possessed mild shape-shifting abilities. That's right. A Yorker doesn't yearn to be out where they dance, out where they run, out where they play all day in the sun, because if one so wished, she could simply just change her tail for legs and stroll onto shore in a matter of seconds. This power makes hunting far easier for Yorker, as they have the ability to lure unsuspecting men and women regardless of where they might be. A mermaid can't seduce you from the backseat of a car or the corner of a bar, but a Yorker can. That being said, Yorker are still aquatic creatures and cannot survive long out of water. So, in the end, they must always return to their home. Yorker come in 3 different types. Some are born with the lower half of a fish, visually appearing more like your traditional mermaid. Others, the curve of their hips doesn't melt into that of a salmon or a carp, rather a crocodile. That's right, half woman, half crocodile. And these make up the most common Yorker. Lastly, the rarest of the Yorker are born with the lower halves of dragonflies. Yes, that's right, some Yorker can even fly. A Yorker is able to get a sense of your desires, and thus can subtly change its appearance to be more appealing to you. But its hair will always remain green. When in their natural state, a Yorker's hair resembles everything from algae to seaweed. It is said that if you see a body of water full of these things, it is actually full of Yorker. And if you're in a canoe and you see large clumps around you, beware, because it's actually the Yorker surrounding you. But don't look over the side. Yorker hair isn't just a pretty bit of greenery. It's just as alive as any other part of their body. Yorker hair is as articulate as fingers and even stronger than legs. They are known to use their hair to snatch those that look over the sides of boats and pull them into the depths. And if their hair gets a hold of you, it's never letting go. There's more though. Just when you thought Yorker were overpowered, they also have the ability to control the weather. Nothing draws people to lakes and billabongs quite like a swelteringly hot day. And nobody will hear the screams as a thunderous storm rolls in. Yorkers are seductresses, to be sure, but unlike Yinapa, they revel in it. Nothing fills a Yorker with more glee than dragging a man into the depths, or turning a woman into one of them. They make victims of both genders, but fascinatingly, Yorkers are not bound by their victims', shall we say, interests. For example, if you're a lesbian woman, to a Yorker, you're fair game. And if you're a straight woman, well, let's just say that for the green-haired beauty that appears before you, you'll be more than just compelled to make an exception. It is unknown whether or not Yorkers are tied to the bunyip in any way, but being malevolent, shape-shifting creatures that dwell in Australia's many bodies of water, it wouldn't be unreasonable to assume that they are in some way tied back to Kianprati. Who knows? Perhaps the first Yorker was just a beautiful woman, given a poetically twisted curse from the bunyip. Regardless, the Yorker of today continue to kill men and corrupt women in the dark, wet spots of Australia. They are powerful, they are beautiful, and they most certainly are not your Little Mermaid. Josh screamed and kicked as hard as he could to shake free from the monster. Its wormy fingers held a fistful of his hair as it dragged him and his little sister behind it. The young boy tried grabbing at the thing's arm, scratching at it, anything to try and escape. But it wouldn't give. It could have at least dragged him by his arm or his shirt, but by the hair? It seemed pointlessly cruel, as he felt like his scalp was going to be torn off his skull. Josh tried to look over to his little sister and cringed when he saw that this journey had rubbed her back raw. A sick trail of blood was now left on the grass and gravel behind her. She too was screaming and thrashing, but even with her and Josh's combined struggle, the monster seemed unfazed. Becca, are you okay? Can you speak? Josh was terrified that his sister's injuries were worse than they looked. Thankfully, though, Becca was somewhat responsive, though her voice was raspy after all her screaming. Josh, I'm scared. I want to go home. Good, me too. So just keep kicking, kick harder, get this damn thing off us. The siblings had their pitiful second wind, but still, the monster didn't care. Eventually they reached the edge of a forest, and finally, that burning, hair-pulling feeling stopped as the monster let both Josh and Becca go. But Josh hadn't expected to be let go so suddenly, and his head dropped, cracking to the ground hard. A muscle in his neck panged as it tore. He winced, trying to suck in air, but winded, it was hard. He saw Becca out of the corner of his eye and rigidly tried turning his head to see her better. She was moving, barely, as she too looked as if she was trying to pull herself together. Josh wanted to get her attention, get her talking, but suddenly the monster appeared inches from his face. There was no texture or detail to the thing's head. It was like a smooth black mass, save for its piercing white eyes. Eyes that tore through him. Josh felt like his head would explode as the extreme amount of blood pumping through him was now throbbing in his ears. The monster reached a hand for Josh's ankle, and in an effortless motion, closed its fist, crushing the bones. His feet, now just like meaty socks filled with stones. It goes without saying that Josh screamed and cried. He was helpless, just how the monster wanted him. Once it was sure he couldn't run off, the monster turned its attention to Becca. "Get away from her!" Josh cried. The monster plucked her up and began to climb a nearby tree. Its body shouldn't have moved like that. No. It couldn't have moved like that. Josh watched in speechless horror as it disappeared up the tree with his sister. He heard a rustling in the branches, and Becca let out a short, sharp scream. Then a scrunching sound, and then silence. Wet droplets sprinkled down onto Josh's face as he tried to pull himself along. "Becca! Becca, talk to me! What's happening?" At last, his eyes began to adjust to the dark, and as he looked up the tree, he could just make out the silhouette of his little sister, impaled on the highest branch. He wanted to shriek and vomit, but in a flash, the monster landed in front of him, jumping down from the tree. But even with its impact on the soil, there was no shaking, there was no sound. It seemed weightless. It looked down at Josh with those white eyes and grabbed his hair again. "No!" Josh felt the fight drain from him as the monster dragged him, limp, into the black of the forest. After a short while, they stopped again, and the monster lifted Josh up and propped him against a tree. He was going to die. It was going to impale him, just like Becca, and then it was going to do what? Eat the flesh from his bones? He was dead. But curiously, he wasn't. The monster loomed over him, as if waiting for something. Now, barely making a sound and coming to the reality of his imminent death, Josh looked to his ruined feet, waiting for the thing to kill him. But instead, it pushed him expectantly, like an ape playing with its food. Josh stayed quiet and quivering. The monster squatted down in front of him, its eyes so close to his again. It pushed him once more and stared. Josh was confused. "What do you want from me?" he whispered. The monster stood, looked to Josh's leg, and stomped down hard on his knee, the bone making a sickening pop as it and the tissue around it were ground in seconds. Josh wailed. He sounded like some sort of squealing piglet. And with that, the monster moved away triumphantly. It wanted him to cry, to keep making noise. Even through the intense pain, a glimmer of hope sparked in Josh's chest. The monster wanted something. And if it wanted something from him, that meant it had a reason to keep him alive. So as best he could, Josh tried to maintain some sort of a whimper for as long as possible. Hours turned into a day, and all the while the monster made sure to keep Josh crying, but also kept him fed, regularly stuffing berries and the like down his throat. "Josh!" It was on the third day that the search party had caught up, and the familiar sound of his dad's voice made him wish he could jump up and run to him. He weakly looked around and smiled when he saw his dad come out from the tree line. Pale horror, but also relief, was written all over his father's face. The desperate man ran to his son and wrapped his arms around him. "Oh, I was so scared, boy. I found your sister and I'm just happy you're okay." Josh nuzzled into his father's neck as best he could, getting a noseful of his cheap deodorant, that universal dad smell. But then, the sound of a twig snapped, and Josh opened his eyes to see the monster now standing behind his father. Before he even had a chance to open his mouth to scream, the monster grabbed his dad by the head and flung him into a nearby tree. Josh winced as he heard his father's back snap. But he was still alive, and the man tried to crawl towards his son. The monster rolled him over, and without looking back to Josh, made a guttural crunching sound as a jaw unhinged from its smooth black head. Then, in a flash, it chomped down hard on his father's face. "Dad, no!" The man wasn't crying anymore. He now just made guttural sounds with the front part of his brain gone. A vegetable. But the monster wasn't done yet. It leant down to the exposed brain tissue, seeming to sniff at it. There was a horrible sucking sound, and a blue, misty-like stuff floated up from his father's head and into the void of the monster's mouth. In seconds, Josh's father was gone. He squeezed his eyes shut, expecting the same fate. But after seconds turned to minutes, he opened his eyes. He was still alive, and his father's body was gone. All that was left of it, some speckles of blood on the leaves. The monster was gone as well. Then the realization set in. It was done with him. It wasn't going to kill him. He didn't have to worry about that, because it was done with him. He thought back to the trail of blood Becca had left, the way it had impaled her, and where, the way it had kept him screaming. Josh wasn't ever going to be food. He was bait. His name is long forgotten. Now, he is known only as the Mokoi. But he was a man once, a long, long time ago. It is said that he was an Aboriginal tribal sorcerer, a man in tune with the greater powers of the world. What did he choose to do with this great gift? He sought out the most powerful being in all creation, the devil of the southern land, the Bunyip. When he finally got his orders, the Bunyip rose from the depths like a great titan, and he asked why he had sought him out. Because none had ever been so stupid before. The sorcerer tried to humble himself. He told the Bunyip that, as it is the most powerful being in all existence, it would only be logical for him to serve him. The man, this sorcerer, probably thought he was a smart little cookie. But unlucky for him, the Bunyip is far more clever. You see, the Bunyip was no stranger to empty words, and was almost brought to his own version of laughter at the very notion that he would ever need someone to serve him. He was a being that could make the sky ripple like it was water. He doesn't need help for anything. What on earth did this arrogant little man think he could offer? No. It was plain as day the man was trying to ingratiate himself with the devil of the southern land. Being able to see into his very being, the Bunyip knew that he had schemed to get into his good graces, to the point where he thought that the Bunyip would reward him with even greater powers and otherworldly gifts. The Bunyip thought long and hard, and if you knew where to look, you might even say he smiled. The Bunyip gave him a list of names and locations, told him that these were practitioners of black magic, people who worked against the Bunyip's interests. He told the sorcerer to seek them out and to kill them without mercy. Then he would be given a reward. So the sorcerer set out, and over the course of only a few weeks, he had successfully killed all who the Bunyip had told him to. But when he returned to the Bunyip, the creature twisted his body, corrupted his powers, removed his ability to speak, breaking his jaw and tearing out his tongue from the root. The Bunyip wanted him to spend the rest of his pitiful life disfigured, deformed, mute, and cast out for ever daring to waste his time. This after making sure that the man had hunted down and killed all those who might have had some chance of undoing this curse. But the Bunyip did leave the man with one gift, however. He explained that he would now have the chance to be immortal, if he so wished. All he would need to do is consume the souls of others. But souls are like fruit. You want them in their prime. Too young or too old and they won't be ripe. If he was unwilling to feed in this manner, however, he would simply wither away to nothing. But the Bunyip reminded him that death may not be the end, and should he die, he might have release, or he might just have an eternity in the Bunyip's keeping. And with that, the Bunyip left the man to his fate. If he was brave enough to die, it might be over. Might. But if he was too scared, he'd have to be a butcher until the end of time. Over time, the Moikoi learned that it wasn't impervious to damage. Thus, it figured out that it couldn't just rush into a village or a tribe and take the ripest men and women. It would need to be clever. Otherwise, it might get torn into bloody ribbons. So instead, it learned to lure, taking children in the night and making sure to leave enough of a trail so as to lead their parents deep, deep into the bush, where he could more easily suck out their souls and kill them. And to this very day, that is what the Moikoi does. So if you ever hear of a child going missing in the woods, perhaps you shouldn't go looking for them. He rose from the black of the lake, his form ever-changing, escaping comprehension. All that she could make out were his white eyes, eyes that cut through the night. But even they were not static. Though tears streamed down her face, she did not cry. That screaming part of her mind he had swallowed. One barefoot in front of the other, she went to him. Her body no longer obeying her. I mustn't. All she could muster was a whimper through gritted teeth. He called to her, his words so sweet, so rich, so delicious, making a dumb animal out of her. He wrapped his form around her, so cold, so dark. It was like falling into an abyss of ice. With her tightly in his keeping, he slid back into the depths of the lake. "No," she cried. "This is not the way." The many thick arterial tendrils of his form slid down her throat, pushed past her eyes, and snaked into her ears. The last thing she heard were his words. "No. There is only my way. There is only me." Kyanprati, the devil, the evil spirit, the imposter, the false, the Bunyip. Every culture's folklore is full of creatures. Whether it is the Wendigo or Spring Hill Jack, every country has its own myths and monsters. Thanks to our modern age, these creatures are better documented than ever before. And whilst America's myths and monsters hold the spotlight captive and ensure that everyone knows about the Wendigo and the Jersey Devil, it seems as though the culture of the great southern land has been conveniently forgotten. But there is a monster in Australia that still looms in the dark and makes all the others pale in comparison. Long before the English and the Dutch came to Australia, Aboriginal tribes, separated by hundreds of kilometres and with no communication with one another, told of a creature that we now refer to as the Bunyip. It lived in the many bodies of water of Australia. For the Bunyip, they were more like gateways, if anything, doors. It could slide into a lake on one side of the country and come out of a river on the other. So no matter where you were, if there was water nearby, so may be the Bunyip. The creature's flesh was ever-changing. Like clay, it could mold itself to whatever it wished. Sometimes, it would appear as a being of fleshy, twisting kelp. Other times, a giant amphibious monster with the head of a panther. Or if it was feeling particularly cruel, it could take the form of a mere man. The only rules of reality that the Bunyip followed were the ones it set. The Bunyip was vastly intelligent. Yes, like other creatures, it killed. It dragged children to their deaths, sucked the babies from pregnant mothers like marrow from bones. But hunger wasn't its prime motivator, no. And as such, the Bunyip's explicit kill count is quite low. No. The Bunyip liked to whisper. It drew people, lured them into the depths, or even urged them to commit heinous acts on a whim. its whim. The minds of men and women were like putty in the hands of the bunyip. But these were just stories from the many native tribes of Australia, right? Surely they had no basis. Well, soon after colonization began, stories began to appear all over the settlements. Stories of people walking into billabongs to their deaths for seemingly no reason. Stories of wailing being heard from lakes that were surely empty. And of course, sightings of an impossible creature. All of which were described differently, but all who saw it seemed to somehow know it to be the bunyip, the Sasquatch, the Jersey Devil, the Skinwalkers, and the Wendigo. All of these fascinating, wonderful, terrifying creatures lurk in the shadows of the United States. And if I'm going to be honest, I think that they could not have picked a better place to hide from the bunyip, the devil of the southern land.